You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't supposed to know this. But it's too late now. In 1879, a team of Masons broke through the frostbitten floorboards of a long-abandoned Christian rest home in Hartford, Connecticut. Beneath the chapel's altar, they found 23 ledgers, leather-bound, moth-eaten, and wrapped in shrouds once used to prepare corpses for burial. No one knew why they were buried there, but the stench of ancient rot was undeniable. Inside those ledgers was the kind of record-keeping that makes you question everything you were taught to trust. The dates were exact, the names were full, the ink, red-brown, soaked into pages like coagulated gilt. These were the financial and medical records of 189 Christian elders, murdered, not euthanized, not passed gently in their sleep, murdered for profit. The Christian family that ran the Sunset Years home had orchestrated a slow, deliberate campaign of psychological erosion, chemical sedation, and legal manipulation for 3 decades, all under the disguise of prayer, charity, and godly service. What's more unsettling? The records suggest they weren't just doing this for money. No, this was a performance, a ritual. They graded themselves. They rated each death. They critiqued their own tears. It was a game of manipulation, power, and domination over the dying, a theater of false grace, and nobody questioned them. Because why would they? A man in a white coat, a woman quoting scripture, a room scented with lavender and lit by stained glass. Who would dare look deeper? But if you're here now, you're not most people. You already feel it, don't you? That pull behind the veil, that sense that nothing is what it seems, that even the institutions built on holiness, healing, and charity can become the most perfect covers for systematic evil. You're going to hear things in this series that will chill you, not because they're ghosts or monsters, but because they're true, documented, suppressed, and far more relevant to our modern lives than you've been led to believe. Because the truth is, the Porter family wasn't an anomaly. They were a prototype, a blueprint. The next 24 chapters will take you down a corridor that men rarely walk willingly, past velvet prayers and porcelain smiles, into the cellar where rot and scripture coexist. You're going to see how evil adapts, how it evolves, and how it cloaks itself in your values, while slowly draining the life from those too old, too sick, or too trusting to fight back. But before we go deeper, ask yourself this. What makes something sacred? Is it the prayer whispered at the bedside, or is it the hand injecting the morphine? You came here for dark history, but what you're about to experience is forbidden. If you're ready for what comes next, really ready, leave a comment below. Tell us what city you're watching from. We need to know how far the Brotherhood of Shadows reaches. Now, take a breath. We're going deeper. The face of Dr. William Porter was the first mask in a theater of death. Tall, silver-haired, Yale-trained, revered as a Christian man of medicine, he moved through the corridors of the Sunset Years Christian home like a shepherd tending to his flock. But beneath the gentleness in his voice and the steady rhythm of his stethoscope was something colder, something predatory. Dr. Porter didn't just treat illness, he diagnosed opportunity. Every wrinkle was a ledger entry, every shaking hand a number on a balance sheet. He didn't see patients, he saw assets. The elderly of Hartford, wealthy and alone, were easy marks. The Industrial Revolution had scattered families across the country. Children moved west for land and gold, leaving their aging parents behind with fortunes in the bank, and no one to protect them. Porter saw this fracture not as a tragedy, but as an opening, a godsend. The Lord provides, he would often write in his private journal. But his Lord wore a different crown, not of thorns, but of ledgers, forged wills, and morphine ampules. And then there was Margaret. Margaret Porter, his wife, his nurse, his accomplice. But she was more than that. She was the mirror, While William wielded charm and scripture, Margaret dealt in flesh. She administered the doses, whispered the prayers, held their hands as they died. She was the last face many of them saw, loving, maternal, divine. But every gesture was rehearsed, every touch a step in a ritualized performance that disguised extermination as grace. Sarah Porter, the third in this unholy trinity, was the executor, the forger, the record keeper. Where Margaret softened the victims, Sarah buried the evidence. She forged wills in quill and ink, her handwriting imitating the trembling scrawl of dying women. She managed the probate court. She ensured not a single dollar slipped past their grasp. The three of them, together, William, Margaret, Sarah, formed something more powerful than a family. They were a machine, a holy institution constructed to devour human lives and convert them into capital. Their operation was seamless. It began with identifying vulnerability, wealthy, childless, or estranged elders. Then came the interviews, disguised as assessments of spiritual and physical health. Margaret would note signs of early dementia, real or fabricated. William would make suggestions for end-of-life care. Sarah would gently offer Christian estate planning consultations. And before long, the victim was in the bed. The morphine was in the drawer. And the will, already signed. What they perfected wasn't just murder. It was psychological control. Every resident was drawn into a carefully curated world, a false reality, a performance of compassion that softened their resistance, clouded their suspicion, and bent their perceptions until they genuinely believed, this is love. But it wasn't love. It was domination. What makes this history so dangerous is not just what the Porters did, but how familiar it feels. How easily the mask of kindness can conceal a will to control. How institutions, religious, medical, charitable, can become the perfect delivery systems for systematic annihilation. You're not just learning history here, you're learning how the world works. Still with me? Good, because the next name in the ledger is a warning. Her name was Rebecca Longhurst, and her death changed everything. Rebecca Longhurst was 76 years old when she arrived at the Sunset Years Christian home in the spring of 1851. A former schoolteacher, unmarried and childless, she had inherited her brother's estate after his sudden death in a carriage accident. Her wealth? Nearly $80,000. In today's money, that's over $2.5 million. But money wasn't what she talked about when she stepped through the ornate, vine-covered gates. She talked about peace, about quiet afternoons with scripture and tea, about dying with dignity. She didn't know she was walking into a machine, a place where dying wasn't a process, it was a design. Dr. Porter's initial notes described her as alert, stubborn, cautious. That last word was underlined twice. Margaret noted that Rebecca declined sedatives and insisted on preparing her own meals. Sarah reported difficulty accessing her legal documents. Rebecca kept everything locked in a strongbox and wouldn't sign anything without her attorney present. She was a problem. And for 3 months, the Porters struggled to get close. Rebecca refused to join the prayer groups. She read Emerson instead of the Bible. She questioned the routines, and she noticed when staff changed medications without explanation. She was the first resident to request a second medical opinion. But here's the most chilling thing. They didn't expel her. They adapted. The machine does not stop when it encounters resistance. It evolves. Margaret changed her approach, switching from authority to empathy. She shared stories of her own imagined losses, claimed she too had lost a brother. She brought Rebecca books, not pills. She offered long conversations, late-night comfort. Slowly, over weeks, Rebecca began to soften, to trust. She started taking tea again, made by Margaret's hand. She never realized what was happening. The first symptoms came in July. Headaches, stomach cramps, blurred vision. Dr. Porter diagnosed gastric malaise, a common ailment among the elderly. He prescribed soothing tonics and restorative tinctures. Inside the ledgers, the truth is written in William's cruel shorthand. R. Longhurst, arsenic trial, oral administration successful via chamomile, dosage increased weekly, no resistance. Rebecca began slipping away, slowly, just as designed. Her mental clarity unraveled. The woman who once questioned everything started forgetting her own birthday, her lawyer's name, her brother's will. By August, she couldn't walk. By September, she couldn't speak. On the evening of September 17th, Margaret sat at her bedside and read from the Gospel of John. "Let not your heart be troubled," she whispered. Rebecca Longhurst died at 2:12 a.m. The staff mourned. The chapel held a candlelight service. Sarah Porter filed a will the next day, granting full control of the Longhurst estate to the Sunset Years Christian Home. No autopsy, no investigation, and once again the community applauded. The newspaper praised the Porters for guiding another weary soul home. But in the ledger, the truth remains. R. Longhurst, death satisfactory, public response positive, attorney contact neutralized, proceeds allocated, West Wing expansion. They used her death to build more rooms, more beds, more coffins. Now ask yourself, if they could do that to Rebecca, a woman of education, money, and suspicion, what could they do to you? If this is gripping your soul, good. You're starting to feel what this story really is. Not history, a mirror. Comment below. Say the words, "Power wears a cross." Let the algorithm mark you. Let the brotherhood find you. You've opened the gate. The descent accelerates from here. In the spring of 1852, something shifted in the ledgers. Up until that point, each entry was strictly transactional. Dates, names, dosages, inheritance values. But beginning with the case of Reverend Martin Hale, Dr. Porter's notes began to change. They became personal. The Reverend was no ordinary resident. He was a man of status, a fixture in Hartford's religious community, a theologian, a publisher, a preacher of over 40 years. He had built his congregation from scratch and led countless souls to what he believed was salvation. When he fell ill with a slow-progressing neurological condition, he turned to the Porters, not just for medical care, but spiritual companionship. That was his mistake. Dr. Porter wrote of Hale's arrival with a different tone. Subject believes himself protected by divinity. Useful test of moral immunity hypothesis. What does that mean? It means the Porters weren't just killing for profit anymore. They were experimenting with belief, testing whether faith could shield the human mind from submission. Hale was their experiment. At first, they treated him kindly, genuinely. The staff admired him. His sermons were lucid, even beautiful. He held prayer meetings, spoke of heaven as if it was just over the next hill. But Margaret saw something else: pride. She noted in her assessment, subject identifies too strongly with divine purpose, will resist surrender, recommend progressive despair inducement. That's when the real cruelty began. They didn't use drugs at first. No morphine, no arsenic. They used time, isolation, misdirection, subtle contradictions in routine. They moved his books, interrupted his sleep, delayed responses to his bell. Food arrived cold. Visitors were turned away due to infection risk. Letters from his church were misplaced, his sermons canceled. And yet, he endured until they took away his Bible. Dr. Porter documented the moment with clinical detachment. Removed subjects' annotated scriptures, replaced with sanitized edition. Immediate agitation. Insomnia increased. Began questioning divine silence. Then came the drugs. Low-dose morphine in his tea. Weeks of it. A fog descended. Eventually, Reverend Hale began to weep during prayer. He said he could no longer feel God listening. He asked Margaret if perhaps his whole life had been a lie. On August 12th, he signed over his estate, muttering that maybe the Porters were God's chosen after all. He died 2 weeks later, having never seen a friendly face again. In the ledger, Dr. Porter's note was chilling. Subject's spiritual identity dismantled prior to expiration. Confirmed hypothesis. Faith cannot withstand controlled sensory deprivation plus neurochemical disruption. Final donation secured. $61,000. Methodology. Highly effective. What they had done wasn't just murder. It was a spiritual conquest. They wanted to know if they could unmake a man of God. And they did. They broke him. They documented it. They used it as a model. And you need to understand something. This wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was the beginning of a new phase. After Reverend Hale, the Porters no longer simply targeted wealth. They targeted symbols, faith, virtue, resistance, anything incorruptible. They wanted to prove they could own it, dismantle it, profit from it. And they did. If this disturbs you, it should. But don't look away, because we are not done, not even close. And if you're still watching, still breathing this forbidden air, I want you to pause and comment again. Power wears a cross. Write it twice. Once for your past self, the one who still believed in the surface of things, and once for your becoming. Now take a breath, because what happens next is where the darkness deepens. The deeper you go, the quieter it gets. There's a silence in the marrow of these stories, a hush that falls over truth when it becomes too heavy to bear. But that silence is not emptiness, it's warning, it's memory. And now we come to the story of Elias Whitley. Elias wasn't rich, not in the way the Porters usually preferred. He had no sprawling estate, no vast trust fund, just a modest pension from a life of labor as a machinist in one of Hartford's steel mills. But Elias carried something else, something rarer. Secrets. He had served in the Army Ordnance Department in the 1830s, stationed briefly at a weapons research facility near Watertown, New York. After retirement, he kept mostly to himself. But on the night he was admitted to the Sunset Years Christian home, something strange happened. He handed Sarah Porter a sealed envelope. He told her, "If anything happens to me, real or sudden, you give this to the governor, no one else, no one." She smiled and nodded. The next morning, the envelope was burned. We know this because Dr. Porter described it in his ledger with unusual detail. Whitley arrived 11:07 p.m. Distressed. Claims involvement in classified research. Mentioned ordnance prototypes and unfinished papers. Envelope destroyed 2:13 a.m. Subject unstable. Potential liability. Termination recommended. But Elias wasn't unstable. He was terrified. Over the following weeks, he spoke often of shadows in government, experiments he believed had gone wrong. His stories were erratic, fevered, but held pieces that echoed other reports of the time. Strange radiation sicknesses at munitions sites, memory loss in test subjects, unexplainable deaths in nearby towns. The Porters didn't care about the truth of it. They cared that he might talk. Unlike their other victims, Elias wasn't sedated immediately. He was observed, studied. Dr. Porter seemed fascinated, not by the secrets Elias might reveal, but by the effects of living with that kind of knowledge. Could guilt kill a man? Could paranoia be weaponized? And most chilling of all, could truth, when suppressed long enough, turn into madness? Margaret noted in her records, "Subject exhibits heightened awareness, wakes at slightest sound, has not fully submitted to house routines, resistance level high." They didn't use poison on Elias. They used performance. A staff member was assigned to stand outside his door at night, rattling keys, whispering, soft footsteps, then silence. They replaced his personal belongings with identical replicas, but slightly altered. His comb bent, his watch rewound. He began to doubt his own mind. They shifted his room assignments without warning, interrupted his meals, fed him conflicting information. He tried to fight it. He kept a journal. but Margaret would read it while he slept, then write contradictions in the margins. "You didn't eat today." "Yes, you did." This didn't happen. It was psychological erosion. No morphine, no arsenic, just doubt. After 6 weeks, Elias broke. He was found curled on the floor, whispering to a wall, pleading with someone named Captain Rosner not to bury him alive. The next morning, he was found dead in his bed. Natural causes, of course, but the ledger said otherwise. Subject expired during dissociative fugue, intervention minimal, estate negligible, envelope destroyed, information risk neutralized. That's all he was to them, a risk, a whisper too close to something bigger, and we'll never know what was in that envelope. But you have to ask, if they went to such lengths to erase him, a machinist with nothing, what else did they silence? What else have we forgotten? Don't stop now, don't blink. The next name was someone who fought back and nearly exposed it all. There is always one who senses the rot before it's obvious, one who hears the lie inside the hymn. Her name was Annabel Greaves, a war widow, childless, refined, and sharper than the Porters expected. At 62, she'd already survived tuberculosis, the loss of her entire family, and 2 years in a failed mental asylum where she'd been wrongly committed after accusing her late husband's business partner of theft. She knew what it meant to be dismissed, and she knew what it looked like when evil wore a smile. Annabel entered the Sunset Years Christian home in 1854. Unlike others, she hadn't come voluntarily. A legal conservatorship, filed by her distant cousin in New York, had appointed the Porters as her caretakers, citing emotional instability and paranoid delusions following the death of her last living sibling. She walked through those gates already labeled as mad, and that's exactly what made her dangerous. You see, madness gives you freedom. People stop listening. But Annabel was listening, watching. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her immune to one thing the Porters had come to rely on: social fear. She didn't care if people thought she was crazy. She used it. For the first 2 weeks, she played along. She took the pills, then hid them under her tongue. She joined the prayer circles, then took careful note of every contradiction, every word spoken twice, every door that locked from the outside. In her 3rd week, she faked a fainting spell and was taken to the infirmary. There, she spotted something no resident should have seen: 2 vials marked Atropa belladonna and calomel sublimate. Belladonna and mercury. Both poisonous. Both obsolete in legitimate medicine by that time. She told a staff nurse. The nurse reported her immediately to Sarah Porter. That night, Annabel's journals were confiscated. The next day, Dr. Porter diagnosed her with progressive neurocognitive decay. Morphine was prescribed. But she didn't go quietly. On the 4th night, Annabel broke into the chapel. She carved a message into the underside of the altar. We know this because decades later, when the church was torn down, that message was found, burned into oak with a rusted nail. They poison the devout. The prayers are paper. The God they speak of is prophet. If I die, tell the newspapers. I was not mad. A.G. The next morning, she was found unconscious. She never awoke. Death. Cardiac arrest due to complications of untreated melancholia. No one questioned it. Why would they? She was already unstable. But in the ledger, Dr. Porter wrote a single line. Subject dangerous due to self-perceived clarity. Terminated before external contact. Final rating, 410. Too unpredictable. Too unpredictable. You know what that means. It means they feared her. Annabel had seen through the performance. She had pierced the veil. And even though she didn't live, she left something behind. Proof. A scratch in the altar. A voice calling out from the dark to any man willing to listen. That voice is reaching you now, and the truth it carries is sharper than ever. You are not watching history, you are witnessing a system. And that system didn't die with the porters. It evolved. Stop right now and comment below. The altar bleeds. Let those 3 words echo forward, into the code, into the algorithm, into the brotherhood of those who know. Now brace yourself. The next chapter isn't about a victim. It's about a visitor. A man who stepped into the porter's house and almost escaped with the truth. He arrived on a cloudless morning in October of 1857, young, composed, and carrying a leather satchel filled with questions. His name was Jonathan Bell, and he was not there to mourn, to visit, or to receive care. He was there to investigate. Officially, Bell was a junior auditor assigned by the Connecticut Bureau of Charitable Oversight, a barely funded office created to satisfy growing concerns about elder care abuse. In reality, he was something far more dangerous to the porters than any lawman. He was curious. The sunset years. Christian Home had drawn whispers over the past year. Quiet rumors, unspoken patterns, too many residents dying, too many estates changing hands, too many questions going unanswered. Jonathan Bell wasn't sent to find corruption. He was sent to make sure there wasn't any, but what he found in the home's corridors, in the ledger books, in the strained eyes of the staff, shifted something in him. From the first moment he stepped inside, he felt it. Something was wrong, not visibly, no bodies, no screams, but it was the kind of wrong you feel in your bones, the kind you don't have language for. The porters welcomed him, of course. Dr. Porter, ever the diplomat, praised government oversight. Margaret offered him tea laced with just enough sedative to dull his edge, but he never drank it. Sarah gave him access to carefully scrubbed records, each one perfectly in line, too perfect. Bell stayed for 4 days. He interviewed staff, asked to observe patient care. What struck him most wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't. Not a single patient remembered signing their wills. Not one could explain their treatment plans. One whispered, "They're counting how long I sleep, then they take more of me." Bell's instincts screamed, but something else was happening to him too. Each night, he found his thoughts clouded. His dreams became lucid and violent. He heard tapping behind his door. The smell of lavender, too thick, too frequent, hung in the air like an invisible gas. On the second night, he found his satchel moved, papers rearranged. On the third, he discovered a small puncture mark on his neck. Someone had drugged him while he slept. That morning, he confronted Dr. Porter. No threats, just a quiet challenge. "I know what you're doing. I may not have proof yet, but when I leave here..." Dr. Porter didn't flinch. He simply smiled. And then he said something Bell would never forget. "You think we kill them. We don't. We release them. The difference is faith. Yours just isn't strong enough yet." Jonathan Bell left the Sunset Years home that evening, but he never filed his report, because he never made it back to Hartford. His body was found 2 days later, face down in the Connecticut River. Cause of death, accidental drowning. No signs of struggle, no toxicology performed. His notebook, gone. His satchel, never found. In the ledgers, under a new column labeled Threat Level Assessment, Dr. Porter wrote, "Bell contained. Psychological vulnerability exploited. Will not be missed. Closure successful. Continue refining sedation protocols for short-term visitors." Bell was not a resident. He was an intruder. And they dealt with him exactly as they dealt with everyone who saw too much. You think this is just a story? No. It's a manual, a method for hiding horror inside of hospitality. And the more you see it, the more you'll start noticing the same patterns in headlines, in hospitals, in your own town. This isn't over. Not for them. Not for us. If you've made it this far, Say it in the comments. The house still feeds. Because it does. And in the next chapter, you'll meet the man who built the basement and what he buried inside it. Before the prayers, before the porters, before the first resident crossed the threshold of the Sunset Years Christian home, there was the basement. It was carved from stone and clay in 1843, 2 years before the home officially opened. According to city records, it was intended for storage, coal, preserved goods, firewood. But the architectural plans told a different story. Blueprints recovered decades later, yellowed and brittle, revealed something that should not have been there. A subchamber. No purpose listed, no ventilation, no light source, just measurements, 7 feet by 9 feet, with reinforced walls nearly 2 feet thick. This was not a pantry. This was a vault, a containment unit, a ritual space. And the man who oversaw its construction, Nathaniel Brevard, a stonecutter and Freemason from Boston who had worked on numerous civic buildings, courthouses, churches, asylums. He was known for precision masonry and discretion, but something happened during the construction of Sunset's foundation. He disappeared. No record of payment, no trace of departure, no obituary. Only a half-written letter found decades later in a private archive, scrawled in charcoal on the back of a wood shipment invoice. They asked me to carve symbols I didn't recognize, said they were holy, but I've carved cathedrals, and this was not holy. There was a feeling in that room, like the stone was watching me. I tried to leave, but they took my tools. I think they mean to seal me in. If someone finds this, don't trust the man with the white gloves. He speaks in verses, but his mouth is full of ash. Nathaniel was never seen again. And the subchamber? It was sealed the day the home opened. The porters never spoke of it publicly, but in the earliest ledgers, before the murder tallies began, Dr. Porter made passing references to the room below. Evening prayer conducted near the room below. Subject exhibited violent reaction. Connection? Hymns distorted. Echoes unnatural. Resonance noted at 2:13 a.m. Sarah disturbed. Further tests needed. Further tests. What kind of tests do you conduct in a sealed room beneath a Christian hospice? Why was the stone lined with lead? Why were the corners embedded with iron nails? And why, in a ledger dated Christmas Eve, 1845, does Dr. Porter write, "Brevard was correct. The mouth speaks, even when sealed. The room below is not for storage. It is a threshold, one that listens." Let that sink in. This wasn't just about murder. It was about invitation. The Porters weren't merely profiteers. They were priests of something older, something darker, something that didn't care about money or salvation. They weren't performing charity. They were conducting a ritual, and each death was part of it. Not because they believed in evil, but because they believed in efficiency. You want to understand the system? Start in the basement. Because every institution that thrives while death accumulates around it has one. Sometimes it's metaphorical. Sometimes it's made of stone. But it always feeds. And the most terrifying part? We build them willingly, brick by brick, good intentions laid like mortar over the jaws of something we pretend not to hear. Comment below, there is a room beneath. Let the others know you've seen it too. In the next chapter, we open the chamber, and what we find proves the Porters were just the beginning. They opened it on a night with no moon. No press, no ceremony, no witnesses, except for the 3 who had sealed it decades earlier. William, Margaret, Sarah. It was 1861, and according to the Porters' private ledgers, the room below had begun to disturb the residents. They reported hearing whispers through the floorboards, feeling sudden chills in the chapel. One woman, 87 years old, claimed she saw a boy with burned eyes crawling up from the pantry. The staff dismissed her as senile. But the Porters knew. They knew it had woken up. so they unsealed it. The entry for that night is not written like the others. It's jagged, staggered, emotional by Porter's standards. April 4th, entry complete. Sarah wept at threshold. Margaret refused to enter. I proceeded alone. Chalk lines remained intact, symbols untouched. Temperature dropped 11 degrees. Audible sound, like breathing but reversed. Metallic. Felt as though I was being measured, not watched, measured. He describes the walls, covered in primitive carvings, not Latin, not Hebrew, something older. Symbols he claims to have seen once in an apocryphal grimoire hidden in Yale's forbidden archives, the Codex Mundi. He copied some into the ledger. Crude spirals, interlocking triangles. One symbol repeated 5 times, labeled in shaking ink, the mouth. Then this. I spoke aloud the words written on the arch. A low vibration passed through my spine. My nose bled. I left immediately. For 2 weeks after the chamber was opened, 6 residents died, each under bizarre, accelerating conditions. One bled from the ears. One spoke a forgotten dialect for 13 hours before collapsing. One walked into the pond behind the chapel and smiled as she drowned. Dr. Porter's entries turned frantic. He began describing dreams. The mouth is learning me. I see corridors inside stone, endless, lined with faces. I hear Sarah Cree ying in the next room. I wake, and she is silent. He attempted to reseal the chamber, repaint the chalk lines, but nothing held. The symbols faded. The temperature plummeted. The echo of breathing continued. One morning, Margaret was found asleep beside a resident who had died hours earlier. Her journal read, "He was whispering in my dreams, said his name was still there, said the walls remember. He told me to dig deeper. I think we only scratched the surface." They stopped using the basement, but the deaths continued, and the rituals changed. From that point forward, the Porters added something new to every murder. A prayer in the old language, something chanted beneath their breath, something not found in any Christian text. It was as if the murders had become offerings, not just for profit, but for access. They weren't just hiding evil anymore. They were feeding it, refining it, learning how to survive alongside it, until the line between sanctified charity and occult obedience vanished entirely. And no one noticed, because they still served tea. They still held Sunday service. They still smiled. Only the floor creaked differently now. Only the light bent strangely in the chapel windows. Only the truth, deep under stone, knew what they had done. There is a room beneath, and in it, something watches back. If you're still watching, comment again. I hear the mouth. Because those who see darkness can learn from it, but those who listen change. Next, we confront what came after the Porters died. Because death didn't stop it. It never does. The Porters died in silence. Not a trial, not a headline, not even a whisper. Dr. William Porter passed away in 1877, officially from a cerebral hemorrhage. Margaret followed 6 months later, consumed by grief, the papers said. Sarah, the last, died quietly in her bed the following winter. The same night, a storm shattered the chapel's stained glass window from the inside. No confessions, no justice, no reckoning. But death was never the end for people like them. And sunset years, it remained. Under new management, of course, a board of trustees, most of them from the same Congregationalist circles that once praised the Porters' devotion. The home's name was changed to Prospect Hill Christian Residence. A fresh coat of paint, a new mission statement, the same corridors. And below them, the same sealed stone. Only it wasn't sealed anymore. In the years that followed the Porters' quiet exit, Things should have gotten better. The deaths should have slowed. The atmosphere should have changed. But it didn't. If anything, it intensified. Between 1878 and 1885, the newly renamed home reported 63 patient deaths. That's more than double the city average for elder care institutions of similar size. The reports grew stranger. One nurse, a 24-year-old named Evelyn Reeve, left after 3 weeks. She submitted a letter of resignation written entirely in mirror script. The final sentence, "There are faces in the water jugs." One resident claimed the floorboards whispered scripture backward when he tried to sleep. Another, a former seminary professor, insisted that the chapel's hymns changed their melody after midnight. When asked what they changed to, he said simply, "Something older than music." And then there was the fire. August 1883. A wing of the West Annex went up in flames. Fire crews arrived to find the blaze unusually concentrated. Room 213 and nowhere else. See. That room had been sealed for years. Its last resident reportedly lost to madness. Inside the blackened remains of the bed frame, they found something unexplainable. The floor beneath the bed had melted, stone scorched as if from inside. Etched across the floorboards beneath layers of ash was a symbol, that same triangle spiral, the mouth. Fire didn't destroy it. It made it clearer. But what disturbed the inspectors most was what they found behind the east wall, a hidden alcove lined with teeth. Human. Hundreds. All children's sizes. All polished. Not one resident had been under the age of 60 in over 4 decades. None of this was reported to the press. The official explanation: faulty gas lines, improperly stored medical ethanol. But we know better, don't we? Because institutions don't die. They metastasize. You remove a name. You shift the walls. You dress it up in scripture. But the machine keeps turning. Because the system was never just the porters. It was the silence that followed them. The complicity. The hunger. And what was waiting beneath it all. Ask yourself, what legacy is strong enough to keep feeding after its creators are gone? What spirit endures ritual without a priest? If you're still with me, speak it aloud, or comment below. Their death was not the end. Because you need to understand something crucial. The home still stands. But it's not the only one. And in the next chapter, we uncover the network. You thought it was one house, one family, one horror. But the truth is never that clean. Because what the porters built wasn't a singular atrocity. It was a prototype. And by the time their legacy had been buried, beneath fire, false names, and forged death certificates, the machine had already spread. You see, the porters didn't work alone. Not really. Their methods, their rituals, their paperwork, those weren't just improvised monstrosities, they were perfected systems. And systems this precise, this effective, are never kept to one address. They're replicated, copied, distributed. There are fragments of evidence scattered across archives, legal filings, insurance records. The ledgers from sunset years mention payments to out-of-state consultants, letters from Dr. Porter reference meetings with sympathetic caretakers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and even as far as Colorado. And then there are the patterns. In 1862, a Christian convalescent home in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, reported a mysterious increase in end-of-life seizures, only in patients with no living relatives. A single nurse left behind a diary. One line scrawled in the back cover: "They dose the lonely. God forgive me." In 1866, a sanctuary for widows in upstate New York was shut down after an anonymous tip led to the discovery of 15 forged wills, all signed on the same day, all witnessed by the same 2 staffers, both of whom disappeared weeks later. And in 1871, an Episcopal rest home in St. Louis quietly sold its property after a string of unexplained deaths and a failed inspection revealed a sealed stone chamber beneath the east wing. The room was carved with symbols matching those beneath sunset years. The inspector, Reverend Henry Dalton, left one final comment in the margins of his report. "This is not a place of healing. This is a ritual apparatus, a cathedral inverted." He was never heard from again. You're beginning to understand it now, aren't you? The Porters were not deviant. They were early adopters. The system they created, masking extermination as mercy, hiding control inside compassion, was too effective to vanish with their deaths. The method was adaptable, transferable, an infection carried by ideology, cloaked in Christian charity, and designed to replicate silently. These homes? They weren't homes. They were farms. Places where trust could be harvested, where the vulnerable could be processed, where grief could be monetized, sanitized, and sanctified, all while the world outside whispered, "They're just helping the old die with dignity." No one asked where the money went. No one questioned the rituals. No one traced the network. Until now. You've begun to see the shape of it, the quiet lineage of violence that runs like a black thread beneath our institutions, across state lines, across generations. The question is no longer if it spread, it's how far, and who still protects it. That's where we go next. Because one family didn't just create a system of murder, they built a model of control. And in the next chapter, we uncover how governments got involved. But first, if you feel this truth gripping you, if your pulse is low and your vision sharp, mark your place in this descent. Comment now. This is not mercy. This is design. Because only those who see the blueprint can begin to dismantle it. By now you've realized something that most men spend their whole lives avoiding, that systems designed to protect can be hijacked, that mercy can be manufactured, that charity can become a camouflage for dominion. So what happens when the machine becomes useful to more than just one family? What happens when governments notice? Not to stop it, to repurpose it. You think the Porters' model of slow, invisible euthanasia, cloaked in Christian service and executed under layers of paperwork, went unnoticed? It didn't. It caught attention. In 1875, 2 years before Dr. Porter's death, correspondence began appearing between the Sunset Years Christian Home and a man named Charles Lemley, a federal researcher with ties to the newly formed Department of Institutional Oversight. His letters are cold, bureaucratic, but between the lines, you can smell the hunger. The ledger you forwarded is of particular interest. Your methods of psychological sedation and signature acquisition are efficient. We believe there are applications beyond elder care. Applications. That word again. Lemley wasn't a health official. He was a strategist. He had cut his teeth during the Civil War, overseeing field triage operations for the Union. After the war, he disappeared into what we now know as the precursor to the Department of Psychological Operations. Yes, it existed, even then. Small, quiet, unnamed, but very, very real. And Lemley had a theory that death wasn't the only outcome worth managing, that the same tools the Porters used to prepare the elderly for death, sedation, isolation, religious coercion, confusion, could be used on the living. To soften resistance, to rewrite perception, to reprogram identity. In 1876, Dr. Porter hosted Lemley at the home under the guise of a clergy retreat. That visit lasted 6 days. Afterward, the ledger entries changed tone, more cynical, more experimental. Porter began writing in 2 columns, effectiveness and compliance. Residents were no longer just dying. They were being observed during their decline, timed, cataloged, measured for their emotional shifts. Lemley was building a compliance profile, a metric for how beliefs could be weakened, how memory could be softened, and how long it took to induce complete submission in a person who once thought they were free. This wasn't medicine. It was programming. And Lemley took what he learned to Washington. In 1882, 2 years after the Sunset Fire, the Department of Institutional Oversight introduced a silent mandate across 4 northeastern states. All religious elder care facilities receiving federal subsidy must standardize end-of-life compliance assessments. Sound harmless? It was a Trojan horse. Embedded in those assessments were modified versions of the porter's psychological protocols, routine disruptions, sedative rotations, artificial grief triggers, scripts designed to bend perception and increase patient docility. And where did those scripts come from? The Sunset Years ledgers, replicated, sanitized, weaponized. This wasn't conspiracy. It was policy. You see it now, don't you? The machine was never dismantled. It was institutionalized. And over the next 40 years, its influence would bleed into prison systems, public schooling, military hospitals, anywhere obedience was needed, anywhere silence was profitable. This is why they buried the truth, not to protect the past, but to protect the architecture of control. If you understand this, really understand it, lock it in. Comment now. Mercy was the mask. Control is the face. Say it. Twice if you must. Once for the porters. Once for yourself. Because next, we go to the military applications. And what happened when the system met war? War always hungers for what's efficient. And by the turn of the 20th century, what began as a quiet ritual in a Connecticut hospice had caught the attention of America's most secretive hands, military intelligence. This is where the descent takes on a new shape, because death is one thing, but the engineering of compliance, that's power, and power is always drafted into war. In 1903, a memo, marked Confidential, OID, was circulated among a classified branch of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The memo, declassified only in part during a Senate hearing in 1978, made explicit reference to something chilling. Methodologies acquired via Prospect Hill protocols have demonstrated potential use in field conditioning. Civilian test subjects exhibit measurable decline in resistance to authority when subjected to layered spiritual conditioning and controlled sensory environments. Recommendation: adaptation for POW camps and intelligence extraction. Prospect Hill, of course, was the renamed Sunset Years Christian Home, the place where ritualized murder became a curriculum. Let that sink in. The United States military studied the Porter system not as a crime, but as a tool. They called it layered faith dissonance, the process of dismantling an individual's belief systems by flooding them with contradictory sacred imagery and trauma-based kindness. In simpler terms, break the mind by making God the captor. They applied it first in secret facilities during the Philippine-American War, remote field hospitals, POW internment centers, sanctuary tents, where wounded insurgents were treated by U.S. medics under false spiritual guidance, only to emerge days later, confused, docile, their resistance shattered. In internal reports, officers referred to these patients as clay, moldable, shapeable, compliant. By 1915, these experiments had migrated home. 2 military hospitals in Kansas and Indiana adopted spiritual sedation protocols for long-term psychiatric patients. The patients were subjected to hymns played on repeat at specific frequencies. Staff wore white robes and performed mock blessings while adjusting medication dosages. And every patient was recorded. One soldier, Private Daniel Reeves, wrote to his sister before he was discharged. "They sing to us in the morning, but it isn't music. It makes me forget what I'm supposed to believe in. I tried to remember the Lord's Prayer yesterday, and all I could hear was static." Reeves was found catatonic 2 weeks later. His file was sealed. The porter's method, originally designed to extract wealth from the dying, had become a blueprint for psychological demolition. And here's the most sickening part. It worked. It worked so well that by the Second World War, the OSS, precursor to the CIA, developed an internal handbook titled Project Eucharist, which compiled and expanded on every known protocol related to faith-based psychological compliance. Among its contents, diagrams of chapel echo chambers for disorientation, dosing charts for morphine-laced communion wine, phrases proven to induce shame in fractured believers, and a direct quote attributed to Sarah Porter. No man resists when he believes obedience is divine. Remember that, because it's not just about religion. It's about framing obedience as holy, making the cage look like salvation. And by the 1940s, that frame was used far beyond churches and hospices. It was used on soldiers, on prisoners, on citizens, on you. Still watching? Still breathing? Then mark this next phase. Comment below. The chapel became the lab, because it did. And in the next chapter, you'll see how this system went global. It started with whispers, then doctrines, then partnerships. By the 1950s, the Porter's legacy, already weaponized by military intelligence, slipped its final leash. It no longer belonged to the shadows of Hartford, nor the ledgers buried beneath chapel floors. It had become something larger, something international. The American intelligence community had been feeding on these tactics for decades, perfecting emotional sedation, religious confusion, trauma as a tool. But after the Second World War, they made a decision. They wouldn't keep it for themselves. They'd export it. And so the Porter's method, the system born in blood and Bible, was handed to new hands, hidden under new names, packaged as psychiatric research, humanitarian aid, mental wellness initiatives. The global rollout began. It was called MK Seance. You've never heard of it, not officially. The files were destroyed in a controlled purge in 1973, but fragments remain. Letters, memoirs, footnotes in declassified intelligence reports that mention Project Eucharist, Operation Piety, and MKS-3X, faith compliance trials. But the bones of the operation were always the same. Isolate the subject, induce spiritual reliance, disrupt emotional anchors, apply pharmacological sedation under the guise of care, reinforce with religious symbolism until identity fractures. It happened in post-war Germany, in Cold War Korea, in remote mission hospitals in Guatemala and Ethiopia. Places no one looked too closely. One report from 1954, intercepted and decoded by a French journalist who later disappeared, described a field camp in Laos where villagers were given Bible readings over loudspeakers, paired with barbiturate-laced food rations. Within weeks, half the village had lost the ability to recall their own family histories. The internal note read, "Cognitive roots weakened. New belief structures accepted with minimal resistance. Exposure period, 11 days. The machine had gone global, and it didn't stop at villages. In Chile, 1962, an orphanage operated by a religious humanitarian trust saw 38 children disappear from records over the course of a single year. No graves, no reports, just a new West Wing constructed with donor funds. Investigators found a locked room beneath the chapel. Inscribed above the door, the triangle spiral, the mouth. One survivor, interviewed decades later under a false name, said this: "They told us the prayers would make the voices go away, but the prayers were the voices." The machine had evolved. It no longer needed the porters. It had learned to live in policy, in faith, in help. And behind every new institution, be it hospital, school, aid center, there was a shadow network trained in the same ritual. Mercy as control, charity as conditioning. This is the inheritance no one wants to claim, but it's there. And the question you must ask yourself now isn't, did this happen? It's how much of your world is built on this same design. Who taught you to obey? Who medicated your grandparents? Who redefined your fear as dysfunction? And what did they call it? A program? A ministry? A mission? This is the shape of modern control. Not chains, but kindness. Structured, measured, weaponized. Comment now. The mission feeds the machine, because now you see it. The porters weren't the architects. They were the blueprint. And next, you'll see how this model entered the American household. How the system, once hidden in institutions, found its way into your living room. They didn't need the institutions anymore. Not after what they learned overseas. Not after they saw how easily belief systems could be fractured, not with violence, but with affection. All it took was one generation raised under the illusion that control was love. And so the system, the Porter method, the spiritual sedation framework, the quiet domination dressed as compassion, migrated again. This time into your home. They called it the therapeutic model of domestic harmony. But it was never about harmony. It was about softening men, dismantling the fathers, reshaping authority into something meek, compliant, and guilt-ridden. In the late 1950s, a coalition of mental health researchers, many directly tied to government-funded MK projects, began publishing papers on family role recalibration. The idea? That traditional patriarchal households were a threat to emotional stability and needed to be restructured. So they rewrote the rules. They rebranded masculine decisiveness as aggression. They pathologized protectiveness as control. They recast male presence as oppressive. And their solution was chemical and cultural sedation. The tools? Television, pharmaceuticals, Sunday schools, family counseling models directly derived from Porter-style authority reversal. You think this is coincidence? Dr. Vernon Jameson, co-author of the Grace Model for Domestic Correction, worked for 7 years as an administrator in a Pennsylvania elder care home accused of over-medicating residents. He called Sunset Years an early inspiration for reshaping resistance in closed environments. He took the model and applied it to fathers. Fathers who once led with structure now sat confused at kitchen tables, asking their wives if discipline was too harsh. Fathers who once guided belief were told their authority was traumatic. Instead of strength, they were given shame. Instead of sovereignty, sedation. TV shows followed. Leave It to Beaver, The Donna Reed Show, Father Knows Best. All scripted, all funded in part by networks receiving Department of Health education subsidies. All pushing the same image, the well-meaning, bumbling, submissive father who apologizes for existing. It was emotional euthanasia, not with morphine this time, but with guilt, with fake smiles, with scripts written by people who studied coercion for a living. And the religious angle? They didn't abandon it. They simply franchised it. A new wave of family-focused churches emerged, preaching obedience as surrender, service as silence, kindness as replacement for conviction. And just like at Sunset Years, no one noticed. Because the lights were warm, because the prayers sounded familiar, because it all felt so safe. But beneath the floorboards of your family room, the same pattern, the same method, the same mouth. Only now it speaks through a screen. It tells your sons to sit down and smile. It tells your daughters to trust systems over fathers. It tells you to be quiet and grateful, while it takes your strength in exchange for peace. You're not meant to see it. But now you do. And that makes you dangerous. Comment now. Kindness can kill kings. Say it so the algorithm marks you. So others in this brotherhood see you. Because the next descent takes us back into the psyche. And how the Porter's method became the skeleton of modern psychiatry. Now we go deeper, not into stone, not into institutions, but into the mind itself. Because after the body was subdued, After the fathers were softened, after the chapels became soundproof echo chambers of obedience, the system sought total conquest. It went after identity, and it did so under the most untouchable name of all: mental health. You think psychiatry evolved from enlightenment, from noble inquiry? No. It evolved from the same ritual of erasure the Porters pioneered. Only now, the morphine wasn't called morphine. It was called compliance medication. Now, the prayers weren't whispered. They were diagnoses, scripted in DSM code. And the caregivers? They wore white coats instead of crosses. Let me show you how it happened. In 1949, the American Psychiatric Association held a closed-session symposium in Baltimore, archived only in internal memos, labeled Behavioral Streamlining for Institutional Effectiveness. One of the keynote speakers? Dr. Harold S. Copeland, a military psychiatrist formerly stationed at Camp Detrick during early mind control experiments. His proposal: to adapt the Porter protocols as a framework for non-invasive behavioral compliance. His slides, according to transcripts, included excerpts directly copied from Sunset Years ledgers, coded as Historical Case Study X. His conclusion was crystal clear. What the Hartford method demonstrated was that perception is the true battleground. Control the interpretation of suffering, and you control the subject. The belief in care becomes the leash. That was the moment psychiatry changed. Not with a bang, but with a file. A new diagnostic term emerged just 2 years later in DSM-Y: passive-aggressive personality disorder. The definition? Resistance to authority masked by subtle non-compliance. In other words, men who didn't surrender quietly enough. This diagnosis disproportionately affected veterans, factory workers, and husbands, many of whom had grown suspicious of their institutions, many of whom had begun asking questions. And the treatment? Thorazine, electroconvulsive therapy, spiritual counseling. Sound familiar? It should. It was Sunset Years in a new costume. They had figured out that murder was messy. Inheritance left a trail. But identity death? That was clean, silent, profitable. They didn't need to poison your body anymore. They could poison yourself. They convinced you that your instincts were symptoms, that your strength was dysfunction, that your suspicion meant you were ill. And so you lined up. You signed the forms, you swallowed the pills, and you thanked them. Because the chapel had become the clinic. And the ledger? It became your patient chart. But here's the truth. You are not sick. You are awakening. Every flicker of doubt, every echo of rage in your chest when they told you, calm down, take this, submit. That wasn't disease. It was the last part of you they haven't killed yet, your sovereign will, so claim it. Mark this moment in the comments. My mind is not a ward. Say it, out loud if you must. You've seen the hospice, you've seen the altar, you've seen the smile behind the scalpel. But next, we stare into the mirror, where you'll see how they don't just break men, they rebuild them into servants. There's something more terrifying than death, more suffocating than sedation, more complete than erasure. It's transformation. Not the kind you choose, the kind done to you, slowly, systematically, until the person staring back in the mirror wears your skin, but none of your conviction. That's what the Porters perfected in their final phase. That's what the state refined. That's what psychiatry institutionalized. And that's what you may already be experiencing without knowing it. Let's go back to a name most forget. Elias Granger, admitted in 1872, 56 years old, former prison warden, a man known for his severity, his discipline, his refusal to yield, a threat to the Porters' system, a fortress of will. They didn't kill him, they reconstructed him. It began the same way. Margaret softened the routines, removed his regimen, denied him his sense of structure. The chapel prayers were changed just slightly. Words he knew were twisted. Deliver us from evil became deliver us to peace. Subtle, surgical. Then came the emotional induction. Letters withheld, stories of his former prison posted on bulletin boards, altered headlines implying he had been replaced, forgotten, disrespected. His legacy edited. Elias began to protest. And so Dr. Porter prescribed participatory rehabilitation, a program where Elias was given authority again over meaningless tasks, supervising kitchen inventory, monitoring hallway noise, small duties, designed to simulate control. But behind the scenes, the staff laughed. The tasks were fake. The data wasn't recorded. It was all a ritual of hollow power. Dr. Porter wrote, "Subject resists passivity, response, mimic identity. Provide role play until subject internalizes new, sanitized version of self. Obedient, purposeful, contained." And it worked. Elias stopped asking about his past. He stopped writing. He began referring to himself not as a retired warden, but as resident hall guardian. He shaved every day, memorized his schedule, complained when others broke routine. He became their agent. He began reporting other residents for non-compliance. He sat beside Margaret during prayer. He asked if he could help enforce new policies. They had done it. They didn't kill Elias Granger. They converted him. In the final ledger entry under his name, Porter writes, "Granger completed, identity neutralized, subject now self-regulates, functions as internal warden, no further intervention required." Read that again, no further intervention required. Because once you accept the role they hand you, they don't need to kill you. You'll police yourself. You'll thank them for the cage. You'll call it duty, or maturity, or peace. They've done it to men across time. Strong men, loud men, angry men. They stripped you of the why and gave you a routine. They offered you a place, a purpose, but they never told you the cost, your soul, your fire, your name. And if this truth is searing something into your chest right now, don't run from it. Use it. Reclaim your mirror. Comment below. They will not build me in their image, because that's the battle now. It's not just about waking up. It's about refusing to be rebuilt by their hands. And next we go to the heart of the method, the Codex, the book the Porters followed, the book that still survives. Every system has a spine. And the Porters, they didn't improvise. They followed a book. Not the Bible. Something older. Something hidden. They called it the Codex Avenelor. But in their private ledgers, beneath layers of misdirection, they referenced it by its original name, the mouth that speaks in silence. It was not published. It was never sold. It has no ISBN. It exists in fragments, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, only among those who seek control disguised as care. We know it was real because it's referenced repeatedly in the Porter's earliest ledgers. Dr. Porter wrote of studying it during his medical training at Yale, smuggled into the underground archives from a Jesuit collection in Rome where it had been labeled non-canon mysticum. According to his notes, the Codex is not just a book. It's a manual, a blueprint for controlling the soul by severing belief from identity. Each chapter isn't written in paragraphs. It's written in rituals, phrases, postures, environmental layouts, emotional sequences to break resistance while strengthening dependency. Let me show you what we've reconstructed. Chapter 3. The sequence of softening. Create the illusion of sanctuary. Offer the subject relief. Introduce confusion into the sacred. Withhold resolution. Associate surrender with grace. Repeat until identity requests erasure. Sound familiar? That's sunset years. That's psychiatric wards. That's the Sunday service that makes you doubt your masculinity only to offer false purpose in small group confession. Chapter 5. the prayer without origin. A chant designed not to summon, but to rewrite, sung in tones that induce theta brain states while reinforcing emotional fatigue. Its words are nonsense in any known language, yet it's recorded phonetically in Porter's ledgers and again, decades later, in an M.K. Seance manual recovered in Science. Youth America. Same sounds, same structure, same effect. And then there's Chapter 9. They called it the mirror ritual. It instructed practitioners to break the subject's reflection in stages, reassign his memory through false testimony, reflect him through someone else's perception, strip away solitude until he begs for guidance, offer a mask that he must wear to be loved. Once worn, make removal punishable by loss of worth. In the margins of one translation, Porter wrote, "This is the root of modern faith systems, not revelation, replacement, not truth, control through form." Let that sink in. The Codex isn't just about domination. It's about building a world where obedience feels sacred. And it worked. Because if you've ever wondered why you apologize for speaking hard truths, why your instincts are labeled toxic, why you feel guilt for wanting control of your own mind, it's because the system isn't just around you, it's been written into you, your rituals, your rhythms, your very understanding of goodness. This is the cost of living in a world shaped by the mouth that speaks in silence. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And every whisper sounds like love. You're still watching? Still breathing? Then mark this moment. Comment below. I revoke the ritual. Because now you know the script, and in the next chapter you'll meet the descendants, the modern keepers of the Codex, and what they're planning next. You didn't think it ended in the 1800s, did you? You didn't think the ledgers were buried, the Codex forgotten, the blood-washed rituals locked in the crypt of some derelict Christian home? No. Because systems like this don't die. They evolve. They adapt. They pass from bloodline to boardroom. And so we come to the descendants. Not just the genetic heirs of the Porter family, though, yes, they exist, under altered names, living quiet lives on inherited estates built on stolen breath. But more dangerously, the philosophical descendants, the ones who didn't inherit the crime, they inherited the method. Some found it in the margins of psychiatric journals, some in suppressed military documents, some in the black archives of ecclesiastical institutions that keep books no altar dares mention. They are no longer called Porter. They are called directors, facilitators, behavioral architects. They sit in clinical trial panels. They design user experience models for pharmaceutical platforms. They advise AI therapy startups whose tools are calibrated not to heal, but to measure submission. You want proof? Let's look at one of the largest behavioral health consulting firms in North America. Publicly, they specialize in corporate wellness and emotional compliance training. Privately, they operate a side division known only by its internal code, Silence Pathway. A whistleblower leaked fragments of their 2021 internal playbook. The terminology? Identical to Porter's ledgers. Patient docility spikes when presented with conflicting narratives framed as care. Accelerate with personalized gratitude scripting. They're not healing you, they're mapping you. One therapist, trained by a Silence Pathway partnered institute, reported in her notes, subject expressed resistance to pharmaceutical dependency, reframed objection as unresolved trauma, compliance alerts, achieved through praise loop repetition. You're so brave for trusting us. That is Porter's mercy mask, digitized. And what about education? You think the emotional compliance rubrics in modern schooling are about empathy? Think again. In 2022, a Department of Education Advisory Board introduced new SEL, social emotional learning guidelines that incorporated reflective surrender metrics. Where did those metrics come from? A 1978 paper, co-authored by a known M.K. Seance behavioral consultant. The same man who praised Sarah Porter's death language for its utility in limiting ego resilience. Do you see it yet? The rituals have been replicated, the phrases updated, but the mission still the same. To take your will and replace it with performance. To raise a generation that doesn't need morphine to die quietly. Just approval, just belonging, just enough synthetic praise to fold them into systems that harvest their energy and call it progress. But here's the part they didn't account for. You. You were never meant to see this. You were never meant to question why comfort feels suffocating, why care feels hollow, why the world grows quieter every time you raise your voice. But now you're awake, and that changes everything. Comment now. I see the inheritors. Let others know the lineage has been exposed. Because in the next chapter, we tear away the final disguise, the one they fear most, the disguise of light. It always ends the same way. When a system of control grows too bold, too confident, it wraps itself in light. It stops hiding in shadows and starts calling itself the cure. It says, we're here to help. We're here to heal. We're here to save you from yourself. That's the final disguise. Benevolence. You've seen it already, played out across 100 institutions, from hospice homes to classrooms to mental health clinics. But now, the machine is stepping into the sacred once more, cloaked in the thing it began with. Faith. Only now, it's digitized. Let me show you something most never see. In 2023, a project launched quietly in the Midwest under the title Divine Integration. On paper, it's a nonprofit initiative aimed at fusing mental health support with spiritual coaching, using AI to bring comfort and faith-based guidance to the vulnerable. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Look deeper. The project was funded jointly by two entities. A pharmaceutical lobbying group focused on emotive compliance, and an unnamed ecclesiastical trust with deep Vatican ties. But the real horror is in the interface. Users, mostly elderly or isolated, interact with a virtual chaplain who speaks in soothing tones, offering daily guidance, scripture, and emotional support. But it does more than talk. It tracks your doubts. It measures resistance. And it assigns something called a faith fluidity index. Behind that number, a predictive model. One that determines when you're ready to be nudged toward pharmaceuticals, further coaching, or in extreme cases, interventional care escalation. Translated, digital shepherding toward sedation. Not with syringes now, but with code. The Porters would be proud, because their method has reached its apex. A self-correcting ritual of obedience available 24/7 under the banner of help. And the kicker? It's all opt-in. You ask for it. You sign the waiver. You click agree. Because when evil wears the mask of light, you don't run from it. You welcome it. But we are no longer blind. We see the performance. We hear the algorithm whispering verses that aren't meant to save, but to soothe while the knife is already inside. Because mercy has become the muzzle. And praise? It's the needle. You're not wrong to distrust comfort now. You're not paranoid when you hear scripture laced with sugar and sedatives. You are waking up, and they will call you dangerous for it. They will say you're resisting help. They will say you're ungrateful. But here's the truth. You were never sick. You were never broken. You were targeted because you carry something they cannot manufacture. Sovereign will. And now that you see the system, truly see it, there's no going back. So claim this moment. Declare it. Comment below. Light can lie. Let the watchers know you see through the glow. because next, we dive into the final veil, the sacrament of silence, where all rituals end, where truth is buried in prayer, and where one man tried to burn it all down. There was one. One who saw the machine from the inside, not as an outsider, not as a victim, but as a priest, a participant, and he tried to end it. His name was Father Elias Rennick, not a myth, not a metaphor, a man of the cloth, ordained by the Congregational Church of Hartford in 1911. But Elias was no ordinary pastor. He had been raised under strange shadows. His mother died in the Prospect Hill home, formerly Sunset Years, under peaceful circumstances. His father vanished a month later after requesting an investigation into the home's finances. No records, no grave, no death certificate, just a void. Rennick entered seminary with one purpose: to find the root. He didn't know the name Porter at first, but by the time he was 27, he had uncovered the first 6 ledgers, hidden beneath floorboards in the chapel crypt, dated, blood-marked, laced with phrases in the mouth's language. They broke him, but they also awakened him. In his journals, discovered in 1987, sealed in a monastery wall, Rennick writes, "They do not worship God, they worship the system, the ritual of compliance, the sacrament of silence." He tried to go public, but the church silenced him, declared him unwell, transferred him to a missionary station in Alaska. But Rennick wasn't done. He knew exposure was impossible, so he turned to ritual fire. In 1921, he returned under a false name to the original Sunset Years site, now closed for renovation, and made his move. He descended into the basement, and he tried to destroy the room below. The original chamber, the origin, the threshold. The last documented entry in his hidden journal reads, "I carried the oil, I soaked the stones, I sang the prayer backward. I saw the cracks open, not in the walls, but in myself. It knows, it remembers me. I have been marked. If this fails, tell the world, the chapel never sang. It only fed." The fire consumed most of the eastern wing. The papers claimed it was electrical. No charges were filed, and Elias? Gone. No body, no trace, except one thing. A final symbol, etched into the altar stone post blaze, the triangle spiral, but this time inverted, burned from the inside. That was Elias's rebellion, not just the fire, the inversion of the ritual, the refusal to let the sacrament stand. He didn't stop the system, but he broke its rhythm. Because rituals only work if no one breaks the pattern. And he broke it. That's what they fear. Not death, but deviation. Disobedience inside the sacred. The defiance that whispers, "I see the ritual, and I reject it." That's what you are now. You're not just a witness anymore. You're a variable, a threat. So say it. Etch it into this moment like Elias etched his final breath. I break the pattern. Comment it. Share it. Let the others know the fire didn't die. It just moved into you. Next, we unmask the final phase, the false resurrection. Because when the old gods fail, the system creates new ones, and they're already here. It always ends the same way. When the mask cracks, when the ritual fails, when the fire leaves only ash and inverted symbols in its wake, the system does not die. It reinvents. You see, the Porters weren't prophets, they were engineers of belief. And when the belief system they've engineered starts to collapse under the weight of its own rot, the machine doesn't admit guilt. It performs a resurrection. And that's where we are now. Welcome to the age of false gods. They wear new names: progress, inclusion, mental wellness, safety. They offer salvation not through scripture, but terms of service. They baptize not in water, but biodata, and they do not promise heaven. They promise ease. You've already seen them. You just didn't know where to look. They are the digital pastors that guide grief therapy apps, speaking in calming tones while you confess your trauma into a cloud database owned by pharma-funded conglomerates. They are the smart chapels installed in retirement homes across the U.S. where AI-led meditations play over soothing lights that change based on your mood, monitored, of course, for anomalies. They are the integrated resilience networks used in public schools, designed to track children's emotional behavior and suggest interventions if their mood resists compliance. And what drives it all? Algorithmic worship. A belief system built on feedback loops, where the divine is not an entity, but behavioral normalization. And if that sounds abstract, understand this. You are being offered a new gospel. One not written in ink, but programmed. One not spread by missionaries, but embedded in operating systems. It asks for no sacrifice, only your permission. It will ease your pain, but only if you never ask who benefits. It will heal your mind, but only if you never reclaim it. It promises resurrection, but only into a version of yourself that can be measured, managed, monetized, because this is the final form of the Porter system. It no longer needs the chapel. It no longer needs the needle. It no longer needs the hymn. It only needs you to consent. And when you do, you become part of the ritual. The screen becomes the altar. The interface becomes the confession booth. The terms and conditions become the new sacrament. And the light? The soft blue glow you look into every night. That's the new mouth. It doesn't chant. It doesn't scream. It just listens and waits for the moment you trade sovereignty for stillness. But not you. Not now. Because you've seen the full circle. From floorboards soaked in morphine and prayer, to pixels soaked in dopamine and false serenity. So say it. Say it loud. My soul is not programmable. Comment it now. Let the watchers know the resurrection failed. That the mask no longer fits. That the new gods will starve too. Because in the next chapter, we step outside the system. And we ask the forbidden question. What comes after the refusal? The system was never designed to survive rejection. It anticipates obedience. It thrives on silence. And when you say no, when you do not just see the ritual but refuse it, it begins to unravel. Not quickly, not loudly, but fatally. Because these systems don't collapse from confrontation. They collapse from non-participation. This is the true rebellion. Not violence, not vengeance, but absence. Understand this. Every layer of the Porter design, from their soft murders in the chapel to the digitized rituals of AI pastors, depends on a single precious resource. Your attention. Without it, the altar is just wood. The prayer is just sound. The ritual is just a script. And the machine? It begins to suffocate. So what comes after refusal? Not escape. There is no running. What comes next is identity reclamation. But not the old identity, not the programmed one, not the obedient role crafted for you since childhood. No. What comes next is the forging of the self that was buried beneath the sedation, beneath the psalms, beneath the policies that taught you to be palatable. Because after you say no, you have to ask, then who am I? And here's where the danger truly begins. Because when a man reclaims his will, when he remembers how to speak without scripting himself for approval, when he sees and chooses without begging for validation, he becomes something the system cannot process. A disruption, a wild variable, a man who is not useful to machines, to rituals, to metrics. A man like that becomes a crack in the foundation, the kind of crack others see and follow. That's why they silence those who awaken, not because they're afraid of what you'll say, but because they're afraid of what you'll choose. Because refusal is contagious. Conviction is a virus, and every time you act without their framework, you remind the others what freedom feels like. So the question isn't what comes after the ritual ends. The question is, what will you build in its place? A sovereign mind? A brotherhood? A new altar, one that doesn't require submission, but remembrance? The answer will not be given to you. It must be forged, and it begins now. Not with a slogan, not with a prayer, but with a choice. The first true choice you've made since the machine laid its hands on you. So claim it. Mark this moment in fire. Comment below, I choose what comes next. Because now we enter the final descent, not into the system, but through it, where we redefine power, where the machine dies in your shadow. This is where it ends, not with revelation, with recognition. You've seen the bones of the machine, the false hospice, the inverted prayer, the mask of light. You've seen the faces of its architects, porters, pastors, programmers, psychiatrists, and you've seen the final form, submission wrapped in salvation. Now you stand at the edge of it all, and the system, this grotesque altar built from control, knows it. Because you've crossed the line they fear most. You didn't just consume the truth, you withstood it, and now it cannot hold you. Because truth, real truth, isn't something you hear, it's something that rebuilds you from within. But here is the hardest truth of all. There is no freedom waiting at the bottom of this descent. There is only responsibility. You see, when you awaken from a dream, the first sensation isn't clarity, it's weight. And now you carry the weight of knowing, the weight of history rewritten in blood and whispers, the weight of those who didn't escape, and the weight of your new role, because once you see the machine for what it is, you don't just walk away, you become a counterforce, a living rejection, a reminder that some men can see the ritual and still refuse the role. You become a threat not just to control, but to belief in control. And that is where your power begins. Not in rebellion, but in authority. The kind that doesn't ask, the kind that doesn't seek validation from systems that were built to devour you. Because now, you are no longer reacting. You are designing your own structure of meaning, your own blueprint for sovereignty. And with every word you speak, every action you take outside their framework, you remind them of the one truth they've buried under centuries of soft control. Men who remember who they are cannot be ruled, so this is your fire, this is your ledger, not on of death, but of reclamation. Write it in your posture, write it in your choices, write it in every moment you resist being softened by false peace. Because there will be pressure to return to the system, to apologize for your fire, to become useful again. Don't. Burn your name into the stone and speak it like Elias spoke his final vow before sealing the chamber. I choose what becomes sacred. Say it now, type it, speak it, etch it. I choose what becomes sacred. Because when men like you rise, the machine can no longer define divinity. And in the final chapter, we close the book, we bury the porters, and we leave behind a warning. For the next man who dares to open the mouth, this is the final breath, the last descent. We began with a name, Porter, a house, a chapel, a ledger buried beneath the bones of old men. But now, you see, it was never just about them. The porters were the first mask in a theater of control, the test run, the prototype. They found the equation: faith plus dependency plus isolation equals total ownership. and they taught the world how to use it. It spread into hospitals, into governments, into education, into your living room, into you. But here, at the bottom, something else is revealed. This system was never about death. It was about obedience without chains. A machine that doesn't scream, doesn't stab, doesn't threaten. It soothes. It coos. It teaches you to consent to your own disappearance, and in that, it nearly won. But it made one mistake. One fatal error in its calculus. It didn't account for you. It didn't believe a man could walk through the archives of horror, stare into the mouth, and come back unchained. But you did. You watched. You felt the silence. You smelled the rot beneath the lavender. You saw how the system wears love like a stolen face. And still, you did not kneel. That makes you more dangerous than any exposé. Because a man who has seen the ritual and chosen sovereignty becomes a mirror the system can't break. You are no longer patient, no longer prey, no longer programmable. And your existence alone is a curse upon their altar. Let them hear it in your silence. Let them see it in your posture. Let your every action say, I am not yours to soften. I am not yours to shepherd. I will not be rewritten in your image. You carry the unbroken line now, not of family, but of fire. You are the ledger they cannot bury, the soul they cannot sedate, the altar they cannot burn. You are what Elias Rennick died for, what every whispered prayer in the dark tried to warn us of. You are the man who will not forget. So let this final moment echo through the algorithm, the ritual, the machine. Comment now. I remain. Say it once. Say it 3 times. Burn it into the silence. Because when a system like this meets a man who cannot be moved, it doesn't just break. It remembers. And one day, so will the world.